So we're going to start today with a joint presentation by Damon Ragusa, the founder of a company called ThinkVine, which I'll have him tell you more about, and Alex King, the VP of Brand Marketing for the Cleveland Indians. The two, Alex and Damon, have partnered on doing a very interesting study and analysis of the Cleveland Indians, some of the marketing issues facing the Indians. So with that, I'll turn it over to Damon. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you. Real quick, thank you to the SABR folks, and thanks, Vince, for introducing us to this conference. I want to admit right up front that although there's some commonality here, I'm 24 years of doing consumer analytics. I'm a casual baseball statistics person, so I'm up here for very different reasons. And so this is that point where we kind of talk about looking at things from a different perspective on the business side of the ledger. And I have to admit, this is my first exposure to this organization. I sat in the last session listening and was fascinated by the conversation. I thought it was a great discussion. And a quick side, I have another colleague on our executive team who's right now at South by Southwest. I don't know if you guys know the South by Southwest conference. It's a rather big conference with marketing organizations, agencies, thousands and thousands of people. And our team is there with a group that's putting on a conference. And Nate Silver is the guest speaker. And I sat thinking about that as I was listening to Bill James yesterday and Bill James on the session today, and I think I won. Okay, I think I got the right posting for that because they asked me to be at that conference. I said, no, I'd rather be at this conference because of the work we did with the Cleveland Indians, and I get to see Bill James speak, as well as everybody else. So I've been fascinated by the content in this session, and I think I'm going to stay connected to this group for that work. But what we're here really to talk about is the work we did with the Cleveland Indians. So I'm going to, just real quick in terms of the way we're going to go through this, I'm going to only spend about 10 minutes tops talking about what we actually built and what we did. It's really more the technical details, and I will be the first to admit it's going to be from about an 80,000 foot view. We're doing that intentionally because we're assuming that really what you want to hear is what the Cleveland Indians actually did with the work we jointly produced. So he's going to spend then the rest of the time really going through how the Cleveland Indian team used the information and what they were able to do with it, and sort of thinking about the future of how we take this down the road. So that said, happy to talk about more details about how we do what we do after the fact, whether it's on the phone or later on today. So I'm going to jump into it. Any questions so far? I'm just kidding. Really hard to ask questions in this thing, so I'm going to wait till the end. So what are we really talking about? We're really talking about three core things that ThinkVine does for really consumer marketing organizations, of which the Cleveland Indians and baseball in general is in that business. To pay all the salaries and do all the things, we needed people to come to the game and buy tickets and buy concession and buy jerseys. And so really what we're talking about is first and foremost being able to predict and understand the impact of everything a club does to influence people to come to a game, to buy, in this case, a single game ticket or a group sale ticket for a baseball game. And every home game is considered an event, so we're thinking about it in that sort of a time series perspective. The second thing really is about accountability, and we talk about this when I'm in front of CMOs at billion-dollar budget brands, like companies that spend literally billions of dollars. And this guy right here actually came from one of those companies working at Procter & Gamble, where we've done some of the same work. So in those conversations, a lot of the session goes right to that issue of accountability. How do I know when I spend $1 on a TV ad or a radio promotion or some kind of promotion, bobbleheads and baseball bat giveaways, is it returning money back to the organization that's positive, and how do I actually optimize that? So the last thing then is on this list is how do I forecast? And this is the big challenge too. So I'm talking about doing all the prior things, understanding the impact of marketing, understanding how it drives people to come out to the game and buy tickets, being accountable. At the same time, I want to be able to forecast performance. And actually, I think Mark Shapiro said it best when we were originally meeting with the Indians. He said, imagine if you throw a party and 5,000 people show up that you didn't intend to show up. You don't have bathrooms open, you don't have concession open, you're not ready for them. They have a bad experience, and that affects their ticket buying that season and the next season. So what we're doing today has a big effect on what happens tomorrow. So getting a handle on that is why it's critical, because we're not just talking about short-term effect, we're talking about long-term effect. So how do we go about doing this? And this is where things get a little bit crazy. Has anybody in here ever heard of a thing called agent-based modeling? And I'm not talking about sports agents, I'm talking about agents. Okay, so we have a couple people in here. So what we effectively have done is build an agent-based model for baseball, for the business side of baseball. And what that means is we've essentially recreated the marketplace. Right? We recreated essentially the greater Cleveland area. We have a roughly 5,000 agents in our system who are not real people, not real fans, but they're highly representative of fans. So we take all the characteristics from the marketplace, whether it's demographic data, socioeconomic data, and we bring it into the system, okay? And we create these virtual agents that represent the fan base. And the reason why we're doing this is because we can't go talk easily to 5,000 people and influence them and tell them what they, and find out what they're doing. So we have to create this virtual marketplace in this computer. And what we do is we essentially train it then to be highly representative both of the behavior of the fans and their relationship to the marketing and the activities that the Cleveland Indians use to influence them. So whether that's how much TV they watch, how much radio they listen, it could be their drive times. How long does it take me to get from my home to my office? Because I may see a billboard, I may hear a radio ad, right? And also we're going to embed that with a whole bunch of information from the Indians about how people buy tickets in the past. So looking at roughly 5 years of historical ticket sales at an individual level and understanding how tickets get bought leading up to every game. All right? And so we're putting that all together in a system that we can then calibrate to understand how things happen within this category of product, baseball. Okay? So we have these agents, we represent the consumers in the marketplace. We're creating this system and we're giving them a base probability of attending the game, okay, based on prior statistics. And then we're talking about what influences them. Now obviously our focus, as I indicated before, is to understand the things that Alex can control from a marketing perspective. But in order to do that appropriately, we have to understand all the other things that influence the likelihood that somebody goes to a game. Many of these things that you probably think more about in some cases, which are things like, who's the opponent? What's their record? What's their standing relative to the Cleveland Indians? Are there star players on the other team and on our team going to be performing, or did somebody get injured? Okay, it can get down to, in fact, even things like, is something else going on that weekend in the city of Cleveland that we need to understand that could affect who shows up at the ball game? Okay? Is there a new feature film being rolled out that's going to influence people? Is there a special at what's the amusement park? Cedar Point, big amusement park. So are they running some kind of deal? So it's really looking across a broad array of what we call exogenous factors, but also tying that into the things we do control, which is the amount of money I spend on marketing, the things I can do to influence the fans to essentially come out to the game. And then thinking about that from a time series standpoint. So ultimately, the system is designed to tie all those things together and predict the likelihood that somebody's going to come to a game leading up to the game. And that can be, from day one leading up to day of game. How do we predict that likelihood? And in doing so, filter it all back and understand the impact of the things that we do control. The return on investment is tied to that as well. So the things that we do control, just to give you a sense that we really want to set this up for Cleveland, is the spend. How much money am I putting into these various places, whether it's TV, radio, print, online, digital technology that we're using today, much more digital technology. And what are those tactics? What's the best assortment of tactics that I can use to influence this outcome? And probably one of the more important things, and this is going to tie into some of the conversation we're going to hear later on today. I think Copernicus is talking about some segmentation. And actually, I heard a lot of people naturally talking about fans in terms of segmentation. How do I deliver marketing that influences not just anybody to come to the game, but get the right people to come to the game? Meaning, the people that I know I can also influence to sell more to turn into more loyal fans. So thinking about the things I can do to influence a wide range of fan base, not just mass marketing to a generic fan. So we think about it in terms of who I can target, as well as overall how I go about marketing. And then the last thing is the timing I mentioned before. Oftentimes in our business, we end up putting timing away, and we don't think as closely about timing. Baseball, it's very different. Timing is a huge issue because you're marketing 80-some odd events every season, and they're all very close proximity to each other. So you have to get the timing of your marketing right. And one of the biggest innovations, obviously, and the complexities that guys like Alex have to deal with today is that there are so many more places to spend your money to market your product, in this case, baseball. Digital marketing is a great example of one where you can change your spend on digital marketing very quickly. So you can time align the things you do much more closely to the behavior you're trying to influence, which is consumers coming out to the ball game. So a couple of the things that we do at that then, just thinking from a high level, is going to be how do I find the right budget level? And I'm going to let, obviously, Alex get into the details about that here in a second from his perspective, but how do I allocate budget overall? How do I ask the question, if I increase the budget significantly, what's the outcome? How do I actually plan? Ultimately, what ThinkVine's developed is a planning system for the Cleveland Indians. It just so happens it has a really powerful forecasting engine and able to do a lot of things like attribution of marketing. But at the end of the day, it's about planning. So when I'm thinking about how I spend my money at the beginning of the season and how I spend my money throughout the season, I can look in this system and make informed decisions about that. What if I do this versus that? Targeting the right consumer, I mentioned the targeting piece. Being able to know how my marketing is working for me to influence certain consumers, not just globally consumers in general or fans in general. And then last thing, let's get down to the metrics of the business. What's the ROI? What are the different measures and efficiencies of marketing? Just as we're analyzing the heck out of what players are doing, we're going to start analyzing the heck out of what we're doing to influence fan behavior. So 2 quick slides just to tee it up for Alex. So what ultimately we produced is the software solution that allows for exactly that, the what if. How do I allocate my money? What if I do something differently, and how's that going to perform for me? That capability allows you to look at the business from really a couple of different dimensions simultaneously, and that changes the game for an organization to think about marketing. And you'll see some of the outcomes from being able to do that. Being able to understand how to optimize overall how we perform and how we spend the dollars. Be accountable to the owners, essentially, and how that investment in marketing is working and driving performance for the team. Ultimately, we still do care significantly about how well the system forecasts. The beautiful thing is if you do everything I described right, you get very, very powerful forecasts. And what we found in comparison to a lot of traditional techniques using econometric modeling, that this particular system did improve pretty significantly over our ability to see and forecast ticket sales using econometric models. So that was a big bonus going along the way, which, to be honest with you, that was one big uncertainty. In fact, this guy really worked as hard to say that that's got to be a criteria for our future success. If you can't forecast well, it's not as valuable to us. So we really focused a lot on improving the forecastability capability. One of the benefits of an agent system is we can always improve upon that. The system can always learn more based on the next season and the next set of context for how we've performed. So those are a couple of things that ThinkVine's done. Again, as I mentioned, 80,000-foot view. Innovative technique in the area of marketing mix, as far as globally outside of baseball, we're a fairly new technology. We've been doing this about 5 years. We did about 5 years of research prior to that about using agent systems to deliver this kind of result. I'll put on kudos to Alex and his team for adopting that kind of technology. Knowing where analytics has gone in baseball kind of set the stage for us to be able to deliver this to the front office of the business. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alex to really talk more in detail about the outcomes and his perspective on this work. Thanks.
So Damon talked a lot about the technology, exactly how that works, or at least a high-level view of how that works. And I want to talk more about our approach and our process for, once we had the capability, how did we use it? How did we leverage it to better plan our promotions, better plan our media? So that's what I really want to focus on. So as Damon and Vince mentioned, I came from P&G. I spent a lot of my career there. I was in brand management, which was very data-driven. That was the culture, the environment that I was comfortable with. And as I transitioned to the position with the Indians, and this is coming up on my 3rd season there, we were sort of undergoing a little bit of a culture transformation, at least on the business side. And clearly, for us, team performance is by far the biggest lever. That culture has been very data-driven for a long time, as you all know and appreciate. But on the business side, we were beginning that transformation. And there was an opportunity, while not clearly as significant as a lever as team performance, marketing on the business side was a pretty meaningful lever for us. And the opportunity was to really move from sort of a gut-based decision-making to more data-driven. And our opportunity was to look at marketing and understand not only its impact, but how do we better optimize how we make decisions, how we plan, and how we execute to improve that impact. And we really started that process by asking a lot of questions. A lot of questions that at the time were, without the capability that we worked with ThinkVine on, really difficult to answer. Questions like, what's the optimal promotional schedule to maximize revenue? What's the best promotional lever for a weekday versus a weekend, for an April game versus a July game? What's the right pulsing strategy and flighting strategy for our media to maximize revenue? How do we control for variables like team performance, like weather, things that are going on in the Cleveland economy? How do we control for that? And those are kind of things that always seem to cloud the impact of marketing, and makes it really difficult when you can't tease those things out to understand what real impact did marketing have. So ultimately, we wanted to have a capability that enabled us to understand the effectiveness and the efficiency of our marketing while controlling for all those variables that were seemingly difficult to control. So, I took a little bit of a page from the playbook of P&G and the work that had been done there in market mix modeling for quite some time in the consumer packaged goods realm. And I was aware of ThinkVine and really respected the work that they had done with a lot of other different clients. And I felt that their approach was unique and different in that it was a software capability that we could do all of these what-if scenarios, that was dynamic, that was something that not only helped us plan, but helped us adjust as team performance changed, and helped us understand how marketing levers are different depending on the team performance scenario. But as we partner with them, I want to talk a little bit about our overall approach and our process. There were sort of 4 steps. The first is, in any good model, is really coming up with the right data set. And for us, that involved a lot of different data. Fortunately, we had that data. I would be remiss if I told you it was in a nice, pretty format at the beginning, but we got to a pretty good place in the end. But we focused, as Damon talked about, the last 5 years in historical data across every game that we had, the daily sales data leading up to that, all of our different media inputs from TV, radio, print, PR, social media, et cetera, as well as all of our individual promotional levers for each day for the last 5 years. Now, stepping back a little bit when we got all that data, one of the important things is how much heterogeneity do you have in that data? So how much variability do you have? And we felt pretty confident in where that was at from that standpoint, and the fact that there was variability in the data that ThinkVine would be able to build a model that we would have confidence in. We also looked at those sort of exogenous variables, things like unemployment, the weather. We had a few team performance related variables that we knew were significant levers that we needed to control for. We also, which I think was unique, and Damon talked about it, the segmentation study that we did. And so we had recently completed this study where we looked at the difference between very high revenue fan segments and somewhat low revenue fan segments. And not only the revenue difference between all those fan segments, but their attitudes, their ticket buying behaviors, their media habits and consumption. And we integrated that into this model as well. And so that was helpful for us to understand if we're strategically going after a couple higher revenue fan segments, how do we tweak and adjust both our promotion and media planning to best target and best reach those segments. So we built the model, and Damon talked a lot about that. It was important for us to validate that the model was going to be better than sort of your standard regression model, better than what we had done internally. I don't want to glance over this. It is very important. We spent a significant amount of time doing that and going through that process. But I really want to focus today on, once we got the model, what was the process that we did to help improve our promotion planning and improve our media planning. So I'm going to sort of talk through that in 2 buckets. First is the promotion planning, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the media planning. So the way we looked at promotion planning was really in 3 steps, and I think it was more of a bottoms-up approach than a top-down approach. The first step was looking at what we called the optimal use conditions, which means for each independent promotional variable, whether it's a bobblehead, whether it's Kids Fun Day, whether it's a hat or a jersey, independently, how did each one of those drive incremental attendance and revenue for games 1 through 81 for our entire season? So we looked at what's basically the effectiveness of all those promotions, all things equal. That really set up the second part of our process pretty well. The second part was, okay, now that we know what's the most effective promotional lever, the next most effective, and so on, let's start with that most effective promotion. Let's build that foundation first in our promotional calendar. Let's do the best promotion on the best dates, the next best promotion filling in the next best dates, and so on, until we reached a point where we had gotten to the promotional investment that was just above a positive marginal ROI. So we knew, based on the ThinkVine capability, if we were investing additional dollars, we would be below a positive payout on a marginal return. And then the third thing that we did is, okay, we've got this draft promotional schedule, we've got a calendar that we feel pretty good about. Let's take a step back. Let's think about, is this meeting our strategic considerations? Is it focused on things that's going to build our brand? We also have corporate partners that we need to think about. Is it meeting their objectives? So we did that check. But I think one of the important things is the ThinkVine capability allowed us to look at the trade-offs. So if we're investing X amount in the last couple promotions, is that the best investment? Or can I look at media planning and say, maybe those dollars are better spent over here? And before, we just didn't know. We didn't have that capability. And so it really allowed us to make those informed trade-offs. So I want to highlight a few things within our promotion planning process that I think were interesting. So first, some data that we got back from ThinkVine. This chart reflects for each promotion type over the course of the last 5 years, what's the average incremental attendance by game. And really the takeaway is you look from left to right, it's sort of the highest incremental attendance levers on the left down to the right is the lowest. A couple interesting things I thought to point out. Depending on the promotional lever, there's a different resilience or responsiveness to different team performance scenarios. So Dollar Dog as an example, very incremental overall, but the responsiveness and the difference depending on a 90-plus win season as we had in 2007 versus 2010 is very different. So there's a lot more variability. Whereas something like fireworks, as you can look at that, it's pretty constant. So families are pretty drawn by fireworks, whether we're in a 90-plus win season or we're in a 60-win season or a 70-win season. The other thing I'll point out is bobbleheads, and that's a very common, well-used, consistent promotional lever for a lot of teams. And we had used it a lot in the past as well. So when you look at the effectiveness of how many people or how much revenue am I getting from those incremental attendees to the game, how do you compare that to the efficiency? So contrasting that to hats as an example, which are less effective, but if you look at the cost of what it takes to produce a hat versus a bobblehead, it's about half as expensive. So the efficiency or the return on investment for a hat is actually much, much higher than a bobblehead. So naturally, for our promotional schedule this year, we're focusing more on that. And while we still have bobbleheads and we're not going to walk away from that, we're reducing the number that we have because we can get more efficiency from hats. So another thing I wanted to point out is just a capability I thought was interesting that we leveraged is developing sort of a heat map. So we looked at, again, for each promotion type, ranking the effectiveness from games 1 through 81 on both revenue and profit, and saying how does that look visually, and how can we identify quickly, what are the top performing games for individual promotions and what are the worst performing games. So clearly in bobbleheads, there are a few games in green that are positive, and there's several that we wanted to stay away from. The other example here is concerts, which for us have been a challenge to make positive revenue from. It's not to say that we're not going to do it in the future, but it's just going to be a much higher bar for us. Concerts. Another piece I wanted to point out in our process is, so once we understood just overall top promotional levers, what's the best way to optimize those, we also wanted to look at, for giveaways in particular, because that's such a significant portion of our promotional calendar, what's the right quantity of the number that we give away per game, right? So, in the past we had given all fans giveaways when they came to the gate. We reduced that policy a little bit to 15,000 the year prior. What's the right quantity to A, give fans a little bit more variety if we can do more dates, B, help our corporate partners who want to sponsor these and give them additional dates as well, but try to make each date as efficient as possible. So in this analysis, if you look at, on the left, doing 15,000 per game, the only promotional lever that's really positive from a profit standpoint are hats. Whereas if you shift that and you're more efficient down to 10,000, they're all pretty meaningfully profitable. So that was a very positive outcome for us. So again, looking at sort of the outcomes that were positive for us, one I think was really optimizing the mix in a schedule that helped us maximize profit and attendance, and really, just purely understanding the profit implications and the attendance implications was an incredibly new and powerful capability for us. It's something that within this context we just didn't have before, and that was really helpful. We were able to identify the marginal return on investment, which helped us make those trade-off choices. And then again, we were much more efficient when we actually did go to market for our promotional giveaways. So now sort of switching over to the media planning side. Our process wasn't all that different from the promotion planning side, but there are some subtle differences I wanted to talk through. So, the first step for us was identifying, knowing that all games aren't created equal. What are those highest demand games and what are the lower demand games? And we developed some tiers to help us identify those. The second part was, again, looking at what are the highest marginal return media vehicles, and let's invest in those first, and then go down the line in cascading order until we got to the point where we hit diminishing returns or saturation. And then the third step was, now that we have sort of the idea of which vehicles to invest in, we know the demand of different types of games. How do we improve the timing of when we spend those media dollars? So can we flight up or pulse up our media depending if it's a high demand game? So if it's a Yankees game in August on a Saturday versus, a lower opponent game in April, how do we make those trade-offs and decisions about how much to spend and pulse on our media depending on the different scenarios? So this is an example, that I wanted to point out in a capability with ThinkVine that I think was pretty powerful and interesting. So we were able to know for each media lever what's the exact saturation point. So, this is helpful not only for planning before the season, but, as we all know, that the performance of the team is extremely dynamic when we actually get into the season. So how do we adjust to that? So if we were to start 30 and 15, can we look at a what-if scenario and know exactly, well, if I invest in TV or if I invest in radio, how much should I invest? Is that the right vehicle? Now we have that ability to understand what is the right mix and what's the right amount that we would want to invest in that scenario if we choose to do that. On the flip side, if we were to start 15 and 30, how do we, again, know if we may decide to pull back on media? What are the best levers to pull back on first? So I talked a little bit about this concept of, flighting the media, and I wanted to give an example of, what that looked like for us in 2012 for a particular media vehicle. So this is our brand TV spend in 2012 versus how we shifted our strategy to 2013. So as you can see on the lines are our average ticket price. And I mapped every day during the season, so when the team's away, it's going to be 0 naturally. But you can see the fluctuation depending on the different type of game. In 2012, the average ticket price is fluctuating pretty significantly. But at the time, we didn't have this capability, and our media spend within brand TV was flat. It didn't adjust to those different types of demand and different types of ticket price for the game. And it's not that we didn't have the hypothesis or feel like that should be adjusted. We just didn't have the capability to let us know what's the right amount. So then shifting forward, as you look at 2013, you can see we're much better aligned, not only to the amount that we're spending in TV, to the ticket price, but also when we're flighting that and when we're making that change. So we know that 80% of our fans buy a ticket within 3 days of the game. So we can literally pulse up our media 3 days before a high demand game significantly versus where it was on a lower demand game or when the team's away. So sort of to wrap up, I think, on the media side, again, I think we, through the capability in working with ThinkVine in this partnership, we really improved our mix. So we prioritized those investments that had the highest payout and the highest return. One of the ways that we did that is shifting from some of our traditional vehicles like TV and radio to digital, which is something that we can really track and target in a much more effective, efficient way. And third, we were able to really explore this concept and fine-tune this concept of pulsing our media depending on the demand of the game and trying to coordinate that with our dynamic pricing efforts. So here's sort of our results. So this is a little bit high level, but I think it is indicative of having this capability in the process that we put in place. Historically, for promotions, we were a little bit over $1.05 ROI, which would mean, so right, if you put in a $1 investment, you get a $1.05 back, and we were about flat on media. And through the capability with ThinkVine and adjusting our approach, we're, I think, pretty capable of getting within this range of projected ROI for 2013. Now, obviously, we need to get through the season. We need to see that come to fruition, but I feel cautiously optimistic that we can get there. And I want to really thank Damon and his team from ThinkVine. It really was a collaborative approach. I really felt like they were partners in our journey, and I feel like this is going to be a capability that can be helpful for us. So just wanted to offer up any questions.
How much does the configuration of the team impact what you do with marketing? So you've added Michael Ward, Jerry Francona, it's a different team. Does that impact the kind of marketing you do, or there's
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I think the question was, the composition of our roster has changed somewhat significantly in the off season, and does that alter or impact how we think about marketing, either the creative we do or sort of how much we invest? And I think there's sort of two answers to that. I think on the creative, certainly. I think now we have a couple guys in particular, Terry Francona, which is a dynamic leader for us, and Nick Swisher. Just from a marketing standpoint off the field, he's just got an energy that's palpable and something that we want to highlight for our fans. So from a creative standpoint, it definitely can change. From an investment level, I think it's a matter of what our expectations of and how that translates into our expectations of wins. And within the model, we have assumptions in our planning phase to incorporate where do we think we're going to be from a team performance standpoint, and that has some impact on the level of spend and the mix of the spend.
Alex, when you're collecting data on the value of promotions and the return on investment in terms of attendance and things like that, were you looking only at historical data in Cleveland, or were you looking at the effect of dollar dogs and hats and stuff that other teams have had?
We were really focused on Cleveland, and I think to some extent a broader, more macroeconomic or broader sort of geographic analysis could have been helpful, but I feel like there's some unique circumstances within our DMA in Cleveland that we really wanted to focus on Cleveland. Oh, sorry.
Down here.
Hi. Could you explain a little bit more about the distinction between agent-based modeling and how you develop the agent-based model versus so-called econometric modeling? I could offer up a paraphrase based on my primitive guess about what they mean, but I'd really be curious about how you basically disaggregate your client base and identify these sort of theoretical individuals and then keep simming them and to develop your model.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I'll expand on that. Yeah, so the way we talk about it, and I come from a background of econometric modeling, so I spent 10 years making a shift to thinking more about dynamic individual models to solve, and this is the key, very complex problems. So simple problems I still use to solve kind of the old-fashioned way, but anything that involves human behavior is inherently complex, and you have irrational and rational behavior happening simultaneously, so you need a different approach, and that's the way I talk about it, top-down versus bottom-up. If I build a regression model with whatever flavor of regression model it comes in, even neural network or genetic algorithm, it's going to be an aggregate view. It's going to be an aggregate representation of the system I'm trying to understand. When I build an agent system, I'm thinking more about how the individual, the behavior of the individual, and being able to simulate that individual's behavior. Then in a collection of individuals, the outcome of that system is the desired effect you're trying to see. So I can do a lot more inherently with those individuals-based systems if I have the right data and the right assumptions about how the system works. And that's the key, right? So building, we talk a lot about fidelity in building these models. I'm not talking about cheating on your spouse. I'm talking about how well your system represents the real system you're trying to understand. And y equals x beta is not a very good representation of how people behave. But if I can build a simulation that says, every day everybody in this room wakes up and whether directly or indirectly, you make decisions about what you're doing that day. You're going to watch some amount of television. You're going to listen to the radio. You're going to read a newspaper. You may go to a ball game. You may buy some product in the store. And all those things can be inferred in some part by your prior behavior, but your prior behavior doesn't dictate your future behavior. So I want a system that can put all that together. So that's really the basis for the agent, the theory behind the agent model and how we use it. Does that help? Maybe. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a question for Alex. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what the meta goal is, whether it's the most number of fans in the seats per game versus maybe maximizing revenue, which depending on ticket prices may not necessarily mean the more butts in the seats, and how you got into a little bit about dynamic pricing at the very end, but kind of how closely you work with kind of the ticket price piece of it on a day-to-day basis, but also kind of, what is the goal? I think you talked about maximizing revenue, and that can mean a lot of different things. So I was just kind of wondering if you could talk about the big picture and then kind of how you work it on the dynamic ticket pricing.
Sure, that's a great question. I think from a business standpoint, we're really focused on maximizing revenue. I think if we can do that in a way that we can get as many fans in the stadium as we can is great. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, we're looking at maximizing revenue. In the planning phase, we're incorporating anticipated ticket pricing from some internal models that we've done to help set up, different, I'll call them demand tiers, depending on the attributes of the, that particular game, opponent and time of year and things like that, and team performance. But, I think that's sort of the next evolution of what would be ideal in this model, is really more tightly integrating and incorporating dynamic pricing. I mean, I think our strategies are aligned, but sort of having those two things talk to each other in a more integrated way, we're just not quite there yet.
Question, taking that dynamic pricing model farther, will we see a day where you have dynamic pricing on items, sold food items, merchandise items based on either anticipated weather? For instance, you're going to make ice cream cheaper on colder days, or based on who you expect at the park based on your promotions or things of that nature?
It's a really interesting question. I think the potential is certainly there. I mean, I think you could probably, from a technology standpoint, get to that place. You know, I think we have to, before we make that leap and that jump, we have to think about what's in the best interest of our fans. Are we ensuring that we're still having a positive experience for them? Operationally, is it something that we can execute well and flawlessly? So, you know, I think it's an interesting, intriguing idea, but I think we, before we go down that road, we want to really think about, you know, what's the best experience for our fans and make sure that we're still delivering on that. That's it. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the time.